The apartment felt impossibly small as Donald Lopez paced near the window, his hands trembling as he ran them through his dark hair for what felt like the 100th time that evening. The golden light from the setting sun cast long shadows across the hardwood floor, but he barely noticed the beauty of it. His world had narrowed to the sound of his own heartbeat and the weight of words he'd been carrying for months, words that felt too dangerous to speak but too heavy to keep buried any longer. Kenneth Thomas watched from the couch, his green eyes tracking every movement, every gesture, every sign of the turmoil that had been building between them for weeks. The book he'd been pretending to read lay forgotten in his lap, its pages unturned for the better part of an hour. Something fundamental had shifted in the air between them, something that made every breath feel charged with possibility and terror in equal measure. "I can't do this anymore," Donald whispered, his voice barely audible above the distant hum of traffic outside. He stopped pacing and turned to face Kenneth, his dark eyes bright with unshed tears and something that looked dangerously close to desperation. "I can't keep pretending that everything is normal when nothing about this feels normal anymore." Kenneth set his book aside with deliberate care, his movements slow and measured, as if he were handling something fragile and precious. "Donald," he said softly, and the name hung in the air between them like a prayer or a confession. "What are you saying?" The question opened something in Donald's chest, something that had been locked away for so long he'd almost forgotten it existed. He pressed his palms against his thighs to stop his hands from shaking and took a step closer to the couch, closer to Kenneth, closer to the edge of a precipice he wasn't sure he was brave enough to leap from. "I'm saying that you're the only person who makes me feel like myself," Donald said, his voice gaining strength with each word. "I'm saying that when you're not here, I feel like I'm drowning. And when you are here, I feel like I can finally breathe. I'm saying that I've been lying to myself for months about what this is, what we are, and I can't do it anymore." Kenneth's breath caught in his throat, and for a moment the only sound in the apartment was the gentle tick of the clock on the mantel and the distant sound of someone's television through the thin walls. The space between them felt electric, charged with all the things they'd been afraid to say, all the moments they'd shared that had felt like more than friendship, but less than what Donald was describing now. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you are watching from and hype this video in the comments. But to understand how they arrived at this moment, how two men who had started as nothing more than colleagues had found themselves standing on the precipice of something that felt too big and too frightening and too wonderful to name, we need to go back to the beginning, to the first day Kenneth Thomas walked into the marketing firm where Donald Lopez had been working for 3 years, feeling invisible and going through the motions of a life that never quite fit. It had been a Tuesday morning in early March when Kenneth first appeared in the break room, fumbling with the coffee machine and muttering under his breath about corporate coffee and the general inadequacy of office equipment. Donald had been sitting at one of the small tables, eating a sad desk salad and scrolling through emails on his phone, when he heard the string of increasingly creative curses coming from the direction of the coffee station. "You have to hold the button down for exactly 7 seconds, Donald had said without looking up from his phone. "Any less and it gives you brown water. Any more and it tastes like burnt rubber." Kenneth had turned around, and Donald had felt something shift in his chest when their eyes met for the first time. Kenneth had the kind of face that belonged in old movies, all sharp angles and expressive eyes, with sandy brown hair that looked like he'd been running his hands through it, and a smile that seemed to light up the entire break room. "7 seconds exactly?" Kenneth had asked, raising an eyebrow. "That's oddly specific." "I've been perfecting the art of mediocre office coffee for 3 years," Donald had replied, finally looking up from his phone and immediately regretting it when he felt his cheeks warm under Kenneth's amused gaze. "It's not much of a skill, but it's mine." That first conversation had lasted 20 minutes, long enough for Donald to learn that Kenneth was the new creative director, that he'd moved to the city from Portland, and that he had strong opinions about coffee, terrible sitcoms, and the proper way to organize a desk drawer. It had also been long enough for Donald to realize that something about Kenneth made him want to be funnier, more interesting, more like the version of himself he'd always imagined he could be if he were just a little braver. Over the following weeks, Those 20-minute coffee conversations became the highlight of Donald's days. Kenneth had a way of asking questions that made Donald feel like his answers actually mattered, like his thoughts and opinions were worth hearing. When Kenneth asked about his weekend plans, Donald found himself talking about the small art galleries he'd like to visit alone, the bookshops where he could spend hours browsing, the quiet cafes where he did his best thinking. When Kenneth asked about his work, Donald discovered he actually had strong opinions about marketing, strategies, and brand identity, opinions he'd never bothered to share with anyone else. "You should speak up more in meetings," Kenneth had said one Thursday afternoon as they stood by the window in the break room, watching the rain streak down the glass. "You have good ideas. People should hear them." Donald had felt something warm and unfamiliar bloom in his chest at those words, something that felt dangerously close to hope. "I'm not really the speaking up type," he'd said, but even as he said it, he wondered if that was actually true or just something he'd told himself for so long that it had become fact. "Maybe you just haven't found the right audience," Kenneth had replied, and when Donald looked at him, he found Kenneth already watching him with an expression that made his breath catch. The shift had been gradual at first, so subtle that Donald hadn't even noticed it happening. Kenneth started stopping by his desk more often, ostensibly to ask questions about ongoing projects, but really, Donald suspected, just to talk. They began eating lunch together. Not every day, but often enough that Donald started looking forward to noon with an anticipation that felt both thrilling and terrifying. It was during one of those lunches, sitting in the small park across from their office building, that Kenneth had first mentioned feeling restless, like he was living someone else's life. "Do you ever feel like you're just going through the motions?" Kenneth had asked, unwrapping his sandwich with more attention than the task required. "Like you're following some script that someone else wrote for you?" Donald had nearly choked on his bite of apple. The question hit too close to home, touched on feelings he'd been trying to ignore for years. "Every day," he'd said quietly, and something in his voice must have given away more than he'd intended because Kenneth had looked up sharply, their eyes meeting and holding for a moment that felt charged with understanding. "I thought it was just me," Kenneth had said, his voice soft with relief and something that might have been hope. That conversation had opened a door between them, one that neither of them seemed able or willing to close. They started talking about deeper things, about the disconnect between who they were and who they thought they were supposed to be, about the loneliness that could exist even in a crowded room, about the fear of living a life that felt like a performance rather than an authentic existence. "I was engaged once," Kenneth had told him one evening as they worked late in the empty office, the cleaning crew moving quietly around them as they finished up a presentation. "Her name was Patricia. We were together for 2 years, and everyone said we were perfect for each other. We looked good on paper, you know? Same background, same goals, same 5-year plan." Donald had felt something cold and sharp twist in his stomach at the mention of Patricia, though he couldn't have explained why. "What happened?" "I realized I was more in love with the idea of her than with her," Kenneth had said, his fingers drumming against his desk in a rhythm that suggested nervousness. "Or maybe I was in love with the idea of being the kind of person who could be in love with someone like her. Does that make sense?" It had made perfect sense to Donald, more sense than he was comfortable admitting. He'd had his own Patricia, a woman named Catherine Edwards, who worked in accounting at his previous job. They'd dated for 8 months, and she'd been everything he thought he should want in a partner. She was beautiful and smart and kind, and she'd loved him in a way that should have felt like coming home but instead felt like wearing clothes that were the wrong size. "I broke up with her the night before she thought I was going to propose," Donald had said, the words coming out before he could stop them. "I had the ring and everything. We were at this expensive restaurant, and she was wearing this dress she'd bought specifically for the occasion, and I looked at her and realized I felt nothing. Not nothing exactly, but nothing like what I thought I should feel." Kenneth had gone very still, his drumming fingers stopping mid-rhythm. "How did you know that you should feel something different, I mean?" Donald had opened his mouth to answer and then closed it again, because the honest answer was too dangerous, too revealing. The honest answer was that he'd known because of the way his heart had started racing whenever their attractive male bartender had smiled at him, because of the way he'd found himself noticing other men, in ways he'd trained himself not to acknowledge. Because of the way he'd felt more genuine attraction to strangers on the subway than he'd ever felt for the woman he'd been planning to marry. "I just knew," he'd said instead, and Kenneth had nodded as if that explained everything. The conversation had changed something between them, had added a layer of intimacy that made every subsequent interaction feel weighted with possibility. Donald found himself paying attention to things he'd never noticed before. The way Kenneth's eyes crinkled when he laughed. The way he absently touched his lower lip when he was thinking. The way he had of tilting his head slightly when he was listening intently to something Donald was saying. More troubling were the things Donald noticed about himself. The way his pulse quickened when Kenneth walked into a room. The way he found excuses to stay late at the office on the nights when Kenneth was working late. The way he'd started dressing more carefully in the mornings, choosing shirts he thought Kenneth might compliment, cologne he hoped Kenneth might notice. It was terrifying and exhilarating and completely outside the realm of anything Donald had ever allowed himself to feel before. He'd spent 32 years constructing a life that felt safe and predictable, and Kenneth's presence in it was like throwing a lit match into a carefully organized filing cabinet. The first time Kenneth touched him, really touched him, it had been completely innocent. They'd been walking back from lunch, talking about a client presentation, when Donald had stumbled slightly on an uneven piece of sidewalk. Kenneth's hand had shot out instinctively, catching Donald's elbow and steadying him. And for a moment, they'd been standing closer than they'd ever stood before. Kenneth's hand warm and solid against Donald's arm, their faces inches apart. "Careful," Kenneth had said softly, and something in his voice had made Donald's breath catch. "Yeah," Donald had managed, though he wasn't sure what he was agreeing to. "Careful." Kenneth's hand had lingered for just a moment longer than necessary before he'd stepped back, but that moment had been enough to confirm what Donald had been trying not to acknowledge for weeks. Whatever was happening between them, it wasn't just friendship, and it wasn't just in his imagination. The realization should have been terrifying, and in many ways it was. But it was also the first thing that had felt genuinely true in Donald's life in years. The first emotion that didn't feel like he was performing it for an invisible audience. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in tension and restraint. Every conversation felt like a dance around something too dangerous to name directly. They started spending more time together outside of work, grabbing drinks after difficult days, seeing movies on weekend afternoons, taking long walks through the city that somehow always ended up lasting hours longer than either of them had planned. "I've been thinking about what you said," Kenneth had told him one Saturday afternoon as they sat on a bench in Riverside Park, watching joggers and dog walkers navigate the crowded paths. "About feeling like you're living someone else's life." Donald had been watching a couple playing frisbee with their golden retriever, but Kenneth's words made him turn his full attention to the man beside him. "Yeah, I think I've been doing that for so long I forgot what my own life was supposed to feel like," Kenneth had said, his gaze fixed on something in the distance. "I've been making choices based on what I thought I should want instead of what I actually wanted." "What do you actually want?" Donald had asked, and immediately regretted it because the question felt too intimate, too loaded with possibility. Kenneth had been quiet for so long that Donald had started to think he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was so soft that Donald had to lean closer to hear him. "I want to feel like myself," Kenneth had said. "I want to stop pretending that the life I've built is the life I want to be living. I want to be brave enough to want what I want instead of what I think I'm supposed to want." The words had hit Donald like a physical blow, not because they were surprising, but because they articulated everything he'd been feeling but hadn't been able to put into words. He'd wanted to reach out and take Kenneth's hand, wanted to tell him that he understood, that he felt the same way, that maybe they could figure out how to be themselves together. Instead, he'd said, "That sounds terrifying." Kenneth had laughed, a sound that was equal parts humor and desperation. "Absolutely terrifying," he'd agreed, "but probably worth it." That conversation had been 3 weeks ago, and in the time since, the tension between them had become almost unbearable. Every interaction felt charged with unspoken possibilities. Every casual touch felt electric. Every shared glance felt like a question neither of them was brave enough to ask directly. Donald had started having dreams about Kenneth, dreams that left him waking up disoriented and aching with want. He'd catch himself staring during meetings, memorizing the line of Kenneth's jaw, the way his hands moved when he talked, the sound of his laugh when someone told a particularly bad joke. It was during one of those meetings, watching Kenneth present a new campaign to a room full of clients, that Donald had realized he was in love. Not just attracted, not just infatuated, but genuinely, completely, terrifyingly in love with a man he'd known for less than 6 months. A man who had never given him any clear indication that the attraction was mutual. The realization had been so overwhelming that Donald had excused himself from the meeting and spent 20 minutes in the bathroom, gripping the edges of the sink and trying to remember how to breathe normally. When he'd finally returned to the conference room, Kenneth had caught his eye and raised an eyebrow in a silent question. And Donald had managed a weak smile that he hoped conveyed food poisoning, rather than existential crisis brought on by the sudden understanding that I'm in love with you. After the meeting, Kenneth had cornered him in the hallway, his expression concerned and gentle in a way that made Donald's chest ache. "Are you okay?" Kenneth had asked, reaching out as if to touch Donald's forehead and then stopping himself, his hand hovering in the air between them for a moment before dropping back to his side. "You look like you were about to pass out in there." "I'm fine," Donald had lied, because the truth was too complicated and too dangerous. "Just tired." Kenneth had studied his face for a moment, and Donald had felt exposed, like Kenneth could see right through him to all the feelings he was trying so desperately to hide. "You've seemed tired a lot lately," Kenneth had said carefully. "Is everything okay? I mean, really okay?" The question had been asked with such genuine concern, such obvious care, that Donald had almost broken down right there in the hallway. Instead, he'd forced another smile and made some excuse about not sleeping well, and Kenneth had let him escape to his desk, where he'd spent the rest of the afternoon pretending to work while actually spiraling into a panic about what he was going to do with these feelings that felt too big for his body to contain. That had been the beginning of what Donald now thought of as the worst 3 weeks of his life. He'd started avoiding Kenneth as much as possible, which was difficult given that they worked together and had developed a routine of spending time together outside of work. He'd declined invitations to lunch, made excuses to avoid their usual after-work drinks, and generally behaved like someone who was trying to extract himself from a friendship without having to explain why. Kenneth had noticed, of course. Kenneth noticed everything, which was part of what made him so good at his job and so dangerous to Donald's carefully constructed emotional defenses. "You're avoiding me, boy," Kenneth had said the previous Friday, appearing at Donald's desk just as Donald was getting ready to leave for the weekend. "Did I do something wrong?" The question had been asked quietly, without accusation, but Donald had heard the hurt underneath it and felt like the worst person in the world. "No," Donald had said quickly, too quickly. "Of course not. I've just been busy." "Busy," Kenneth had repeated, and something in his tone had made Donald look up from his computer screen to meet Kenneth's eyes. "Busy enough that you can't grab lunch with me anymore? Busy enough that you leave every day at exactly 5 instead of staying to talk? Busy enough that you've been avoiding the break room when you know I'll be there?" Donald had felt his cheeks burn with embarrassment and something that might have been shame. "I haven't been avoiding the break room." "Donald," Kenneth had said, and his name in Kenneth's mouth had sounded like a plea. "Talk to me, please. Whatever's going on, whatever I did, just tell me so I can fix it." The earnestness in Kenneth's voice, the obvious distress at the thought that he might have done something to hurt Donald, had been almost more than Donald could bear. He'd wanted to tell Kenneth everything, wanted to explain that the problem wasn't something Kenneth had done, but something Donald felt. Something that was growing stronger every day and threatening to destroy the friendship that had become the most important thing in his life. Instead, he'd said, "There's nothing to fix. I told you, I've just been busy." Kenneth had stared at him for a long moment, and Donald had seen something shift in his expression, something that looked like resignation mixed with disappointment. "Okay," Kenneth had said finally. "If that's what you want to tell me, okay." He'd walked away then, and Donald had spent the entire weekend replaying that conversation and hating himself for being too much of a coward to tell the truth. The weekend had been torture. Donald had wandered around his apartment, unable to concentrate on anything, picking up books and putting them down unread, starting movies and turning them off after 10 minutes, generally behaving like someone who was coming apart at the seams. By Sunday evening, he'd been ready to call Kenneth and tell him everything. Consequences be damned. He'd actually picked up his phone 3 times, had Kenneth's number pulled up and ready to dial, before losing his nerve and setting the phone aside. Monday morning had been awkward in a way that made Donald's skin crawl. Kenneth had been polite but distant, greeting Donald with a professional nod instead of his usual warm smile, keeping their interactions strictly work-related, and generally behaving like someone who had gotten the message that his friendship wasn't wanted. It had been exactly what Donald thought he'd wanted, the space and distance he thought he needed to get his feelings under control. Instead, it had felt like losing a limb, like something essential had been cut away and he was trying to function while bleeding out. By Tuesday, Donald had been desperate enough to consider looking for a new job, anything to get away from the daily torture of seeing Kenneth and not being able to talk to him the way they used to talk, not being able to make him laugh or share the small observations and inside jokes that had become such an important part of Donald's day. Wednesday had been the breaking point. Donald had been eating lunch alone at his desk, picking at a sandwich and trying not to look toward the break room where he could hear Kenneth talking and laughing with some of their other colleagues, when William Ward from accounting had stopped by his desk. "You and Kenneth have a fight or something?" William had asked without preamble, perching on the edge of Donald's desk in a way that suggested he was settling in for a conversation. "What?" Donald had said, startled both by the question and by William's presence. They were friendly enough colleagues, but they'd never had the kind of relationship that involved personal conversations. "You and Kenneth," William had repeated. "You guys used to be joined at the hip, and now you barely look at each other. Did something happen?" Donald had felt his face flush hot with embarrassment. If William had noticed the change in their dynamic, then probably everyone in the office had noticed, which meant their personal drama was becoming workplace gossip. "We didn't have a fight," Donald had said, which was technically true. "We're just busy with different projects." William had raised an eyebrow in a way that suggested he wasn't buying that explanation. "Uh-huh, and that's why Kenneth spent 20 minutes yesterday asking George Richardson if he thought you seemed upset about something." Donald's heart had done something complicated in his chest at that information. "He did?" "He's worried about you," William had said, his expression softening slightly. "Whatever happened between you two, he thinks it's his fault, and it's eating at him." The idea that Kenneth was blaming himself for Donald's withdrawal had been like a knife twisting in Donald's chest. He'd spent the rest of the day trying to work up the courage to approach Kenneth, to explain that none of this was Kenneth's fault, that the problem was entirely Donald's and had nothing to do with anything Kenneth had done wrong. But every time he'd looked in Kenneth's direction, every time he'd started to get up from his desk with the intention of walking over and starting a conversation, he'd lost his nerve. The fear of revealing too much, of saying something that would make Kenneth uncomfortable or, worse, disgusted, had kept him frozen in place. Thursday had been more of the same, a day of stolen glances and missed opportunities, of conversations Donald had rehearsed in his head but never had the courage to actually start. And then it was Friday evening, and Donald had been getting ready to leave the office when he'd realized Kenneth was still at his desk, working late on a project that had been giving him trouble all week. The office was nearly empty, just the two of them and a few other late workers scattered throughout the building. Donald had stood by the elevator for 5 full minutes, his finger hovering over the call button, before making a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. Instead of getting on the elevator, he'd walked back through the empty office to Kenneth's desk. "Hey," he'd said softly, not wanting to startle Kenneth, who had been completely absorbed in whatever he was working on. Kenneth had looked up, and for just a moment, his face had lit up with something that looked like relief and happiness before he'd remembered that they weren't talking the way they used to talk, and his expression had become carefully neutral. "Hey," Kenneth had replied. "Working late?" "I was about to leave," Donald had said, then took a breath and forced himself to continue. "But I wanted to see if you needed help with anything. That Morrison campaign has been giving you trouble all week." Kenneth had stared at him for a moment, as if trying to figure out if this was some kind of trick or test. "I don't want to keep you," Kenneth had said carefully. "I'm sure you have plans." I don't, Donald had said too quickly and with too much emphasis. I don't have plans. I could stay and help if you want. Something had shifted in Kenneth's expression, then some of the careful distance melting away to reveal the hurt and confusion that had been hiding underneath. I don't understand what's happening here, Donald, Kenneth had said quietly. 3 weeks ago we were friends, good friends, and now you can barely stand to be in the same room with me. If I did something to upset you, if I crossed some line I didn't know existed, just tell me what it was so I can apologize and we can move past it. The pain in Kenneth's voice had been almost more than Donald could bear. He'd sunk into the chair next to Kenneth's desk, suddenly feeling exhausted by the effort of pretending everything was normal. You didn't do anything wrong, Donald had said, his voice barely above a whisper. Kenneth, you didn't do anything wrong. This is all me. Then what is it? Kenneth had asked, leaning forward slightly, his eyes searching Donald's face. Because I miss talking to you. I miss having lunch with you and hearing about your weekend and making you laugh at stupid jokes. I miss being your friend, and I don't understand why that had to stop. Donald had felt something crack open in his chest at Kenneth's words, some wall he'd been building to protect himself crumbling under the weight of Kenneth's obvious sincerity. I miss that too, Donald had admitted. I miss it so much it's been making me crazy. Then why? Kenneth had asked, and the question had hung in the air between them, heavy with all the things Donald had been afraid to say. Donald had looked at Kenneth's face, at the confusion and hurt and hope warring in his expression, and realized that he was tired of being afraid, tired of protecting himself from possibilities that might never materialize, tired of living a life that felt like he was constantly holding his breath. Because I was scared, Donald had said, the words coming out in a rush. Because somewhere along the way, being your friend stopped feeling like enough, and that terrified me. Kenneth had gone very still, his eyes widening slightly as he processed what Donald had just said. What do you mean? Kenneth had asked, his voice soft and careful. Donald had taken a shaky breath, knowing that this was the moment where everything changed, where he either found the courage to tell the truth or spent the rest of his life wondering what might have happened if he'd been braver. I mean that I have feelings for you, Donald had said, the words feeling both impossible and inevitable. I mean that I'm in love with you, and I didn't know how to handle that, so I tried to put some distance between us so I could get over it. Kenneth had stared at him for what felt like an eternity, his expression unreadable, and Donald had felt his heart hammering against his ribs as he waited for Kenneth to say something, anything, even if it was rejection. Donald, Kenneth had said finally, and his voice had sounded strange, rough with some emotion Donald couldn't identify. I know, Donald had said quickly, wanting to save Kenneth from having to find a kind way to let him down. I know this is probably weird and uncomfortable for you, and I'm sorry, I should have kept it to myself. I should have figured out how to deal with it without making things awkward between us. Donald, Kenneth had said again, more firmly this time, and something in his tone had made Donald stop talking and look at him properly. Kenneth's eyes had been bright with unshed tears, and his hands had been trembling slightly where they rested on his desk. You think I don't feel the same way, Kenneth had said, and it hadn't been a question. Donald had felt the world tilt slightly on its axis. Do you? Instead of answering directly, Kenneth had reached across the small space between their chairs and taken Donald's hand in both of his touch warm and gentle and electric. I broke up with Patricia because I realized I was comparing every moment with her to the moments I spent talking to you in the break room, Kenneth had said, his thumb tracing across Donald's knuckles in a gesture that felt both intimate and reverent. I moved across the country and to take this job because I needed to get away from a life that felt like I was playing a role in someone else's story, and then I met you and realized that maybe I hadn't been looking for a new place. Maybe I'd been looking for a new person to be. Donald had felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes, overwhelmed by the relief and joy and terror of Kenneth's words. When you started avoiding me, Kenneth had continued, I thought I'd imagined it all. I thought I'd been projecting my own feelings onto you, seeing something that wasn't there because I wanted it to be there so badly. It was there, Donald had said, his voice thick with emotion. It's been there for months. I just didn't know how to tell you. Kenneth had smiled then, the first real smile Donald had seen from him in weeks, and it had been like watching the sun come up after the longest night of the year. "So what do we do now?" Kenneth had asked, and the question had felt like an invitation, like a door opening onto a future Donald had been afraid to imagine. "I don't know," Donald had admitted. "I've never done this before. I've never felt like this before." "Neither have I," Kenneth had said, "but maybe we can figure it out together." They had sat there in the empty office, holding hands and looking at each other like they were seeing each other clearly for the first time, until the cleaning crew had arrived and they'd realized they needed to have this conversation somewhere more private. "Come home with me," Kenneth had said, and then immediately flushed red. "I mean, come to my apartment. To talk, so we can talk without worrying about who might overhear us." Donald had nodded, not trusting his voice, and they had gathered their things and left the office together, their hands brushing as they walked, but not quite holding hands, not yet ready for that level of public display, but not able to completely avoid touching each other either. Kenneth's apartment had been exactly what Donald had expected, warm and cluttered in a way that suggested someone who valued comfort over perfection, with bookshelves lining every wall and plants in various stages of thriving scattered throughout the living room. It had felt like stepping into a space that was completely, authentically Kenneth, and Donald had felt some of his nervousness ease just from being surrounded by evidence of Kenneth's actual life, rather than the carefully professional version of himself that existed at work. "Do you want something to drink?" Kenneth had asked, hovering near the kitchen with the kind of nervous energy that suggested he wasn't sure what the protocol was for this situation either. "Sure," Donald had said, though he wasn't sure his stomach could handle anything more complicated than water. Kenneth had busied himself making coffee, and Donald had wandered around the living room, taking in the details that painted a picture of who Kenneth was when he wasn't at work. There had been art books and novels scattered across the coffee table, a guitar leaning against one wall, framed photographs of what looked like family and friends from his previous life in Portland. "I keep thinking I'm going to wake up and realize this whole conversation was just wishful thinking," Kenneth had said from the kitchen, and Donald had turned to find Kenneth watching him with an expression that was equal parts hope and terror. "If it is, then we're having the same dream," Donald had replied, and Kenneth had smiled, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. They had settled on opposite ends of Kenneth's couch with their coffee mugs, close enough to touch but not quite touching. Both of them seeming to understand that they needed to navigate this carefully, that rushing into anything physical would complicate an emotional situation that was already overwhelming. "Can I ask you something?" Kenneth had said after they'd sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes. "Anything," Donald had replied, and meant it. "When did you know?" Kenneth had asked. "When did you realize that what you were feeling was more than friendship?" Donald had thought about it, tracing back through the weeks and months of their friendship to pinpoint the moment when his feelings had shifted from platonic to romantic. "I think it was gradual at first," Donald had said slowly. "But there was this moment, maybe 6 weeks ago, when you were telling me about some argument you'd had with your neighbor, and you were getting really animated about it, using your hands to gesture, and I realized I could watch you talk about anything, even something completely mundane, and be completely captivated. That's when I knew I was in trouble." Kenneth had smiled, a soft, almost shy expression that made Donald's heart do something complicated in his chest. "For me, it was the day you stayed late to help me with the Morrison presentation," Kenneth had said. "You didn't have to do that. It wasn't your project, but you stayed anyway because you knew I was stressed about it. And when we finally got it right, around 10 o'clock that night, you looked so happy about my success, like my victory was your victory too. I realized that I'd never had anyone in my life who cared about my happiness, that genuinely, that selflessly." Donald had remembered that night, remembered the satisfaction he'd felt when Kenneth had finally been happy with the presentation, remembered the way Kenneth had looked at him when they'd finally called it done, like Donald had just given him the best gift in the world. "I wanted to kiss you that night," Kenneth had continued, his voice soft with confession. "We were standing by your desk, and you had this huge smile on your face, and I wanted to kiss you so badly I had to physically step away from you." The admission had hit Donald like a physical blow. Not because it was unwelcome, but because it recontextualized that entire evening, made him realize that the electricity he'd felt between them hadn't been one-sided after all. I thought about that night for weeks afterward, Donald had said. I kept replaying it in my head, wondering if I'd imagined the way you looked at me. You didn't imagine it, Kenneth had said, and something in his voice had made Donald look up to find Kenneth watching him with an intensity that made his breath catch. They had been moving closer to each other on the couch without Donald realizing it, the space between them shrinking as they talked, as they shared these confessions that felt too intimate for the distance they'd been maintaining. I'm scared, Donald had admitted, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Of what? Kenneth had asked gently. Of this changing everything, Donald had said. Of losing you if this doesn't work out. Of not being good at this, at being with someone, at being the kind of person you deserve. Kenneth had reached out then, his fingers finding Donald's and intertwining with them, and the simple contact had felt like an anchor in the storm of Donald's anxiety. I'm scared too, CMM, Kenneth had said. I'm terrified, actually. But I'm more scared of spending the rest of my life wondering what could have happened if we'd been brave enough to try. Donald had looked down at their joined hands, at the way Kenneth's fingers fit perfectly between his own, and felt something settle in his chest, some piece of himself that had been restless and searching finally finding its place. So we try? Donald had asked, looking up to meet Kenneth's eyes. We try, Kenneth had confirmed, and then he'd smiled, that brilliant, transformative smile that had been making Donald's heart race for months. We take it slow, we figure it out as we go, and we try. They had talked until nearly midnight, sharing stories and fears and hopes, mapping out the territory of this new thing between them, with the careful attention of explorers charting unknown land. Kenneth had told Donald about his previous relationships, about the pattern of dissatisfaction and restlessness that had followed him through every romantic connection he had ever attempted, about the growing certainty that he'd been looking for something he couldn't name in people who could never provide it. Donald had shared his own history, the long line of relationships that had felt like performances, the growing sense that he was fundamentally broken or missing some essential component that would allow him to love the way other people seemed to love so effortlessly. I used to think there was something wrong with me, Donald had said, his head resting against the back of Kenneth's couch, his body finally relaxed for the first time in weeks. I thought maybe I just wasn't capable of the kind of love that other people talked about. And now, Kenneth had asked, shifting slightly so he was facing Donald more fully. Now I think maybe I was just looking in the wrong places, Donald had said, meeting Kenneth's eyes. Or for the wrong people. Kenneth had reached out and cupped Donald's face in his palm, his thumb brushing across Donald's cheekbone in a gesture so tender it had made Donald's eyes flutter closed. Can I kiss you? Kenneth had asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Donald had opened his eyes and found Kenneth watching him with an expression of such open vulnerability, such obvious desire mixed with uncertainty, that it had taken his breath away. Please, Donald had said, and the word had come out rougher than he'd intended, thick with months of wanting. Kenneth had leaned closer, slowly, giving Donald time to change his mind, time to pull away if this was too much too fast. Instead, Donald had found himself leaning in as well, closing the distance between them until their lips were barely touching, until he could feel the warmth of Kenneth's breath against his skin. The first kiss had been soft, tentative, a question more than a statement. Kenneth's lips had been warm and gentle against his, and Donald had felt something electric run through his entire body at the contact, something that made his hands tremble and his heart race. When they'd pulled apart, both breathing slightly harder than normal, Kenneth had rested his forehead against Donald's, their faces still close enough that Donald could see the flecks of gold in Kenneth's green eyes. Wow, Kenneth had whispered, and Donald had felt a smile tug at the corners of his mouth. Yeah, Donald had agreed. Wow. They had kissed again, longer this time, with more certainty and less hesitation, and Donald had felt like something fundamental had shifted in the universe, like he was finally, for the first time in his life, exactly where he was supposed to be. When they'd finally pulled apart for good, both of them flushed and slightly dazed, Kenneth had taken Donald's hand again, their fingers intertwining automatically. I should probably go home, Donald had said, though the last thing he wanted was to leave, to break this spell they'd woven around themselves. You should, Kenneth had agreed, though his grip on Donald's hand had tightened slightly, as if he didn't want to let go either. They had sat there for another few minutes, neither of them moving, both of them seeming to understand that leaving would mean returning to the real world, where they would have to figure out how to navigate this new dynamic at work, how to handle the practical implications of what had just happened between them. What do we tell people? Donald had asked eventually. The truth, Kenneth had said simply, when we're ready, when we figure out what the truth is. Donald had nodded, understanding that they needed time to explore this thing between them before they made it public, before they subjected it to the scrutiny and opinions of their colleagues and friends. I want to see you tomorrow, Kenneth had said as they had finally stood up from the couch. Not at work, I mean. I want to take you to dinner, or for a walk, or just to sit somewhere and talk more. I want to do this properly. The word properly had made Donald's heart do something complicated in his chest. The implication that Kenneth wanted to court him, to treat this like the beginning of something real and significant, rather than just a moment of weakness or experimentation. I'd like that, Donald had said, and Kenneth had smiled, that brilliant, transformative smile that made Donald feel like he could do anything, be anyone, as long as Kenneth kept looking at him like that. Kenneth had walked him to the door, and they'd stood there for a moment, both of them seeming reluctant to end the evening, to return to their separate lives in separate beds. Thank you, Kenneth had said quietly, for being brave enough to tell me the truth, for giving us a chance to figure this out. Donald had reached up and touched Kenneth's face, marveling at the fact that he was allowed to do that now, that this man who had been occupying his thoughts and dreams for months was looking at him like he was something precious and wonderful. Thank you for feeling the same way, Donald had said, and then he'd kissed Kenneth one more time, soft and sweet and full of promise. The next morning had been surreal in the best possible way. Donald had woken up with a sense of lightness he hadn't felt in months, maybe years. The constant background anxiety that had been his companion for so long, replaced by something that felt suspiciously like happiness. He'd found himself humming in the shower, actually humming like some character in a romantic comedy, and the realization had made him laugh out loud at his own ridiculousness. Kenneth had texted him while he was getting dressed, a simple good morning followed by, still can't quite believe last night was real. And Donald had found himself grinning at his phone like a teenager with his first crush. It was real, Donald had texted back, and I can't wait to see you tonight. They had agreed to meet at a small restaurant in Kenneth's neighborhood, somewhere quiet where they could talk without worrying about running into colleagues or having to explain their presence together to anyone who might ask uncomfortable questions. The workday had passed in a blur of stolen glances and shared smiles, both of them trying to maintain their professional demeanor while navigating this new awareness of each other. It had been like learning to walk all over Boynton, having to consciously think about how to interact normally when everything between them had fundamentally changed. You seem different today, William Ward had commented during their afternoon meeting, studying Donald with the kind of attention that made Donald wonder if his feelings were written across his face in neon letters. Different how? Donald had asked, trying to keep his voice casual. Happier, William had said simply. More like yourself, if that makes sense. It had made perfect sense, actually. For the first time in months, Donald had felt like himself, like the person he was meant to be, rather than the person he thought he should be. The restaurant Kenneth had chosen had been perfect, small and dimly lit with tables far enough apart to allow for private conversation. Kenneth had been waiting for him when he'd arrived, looking nervous and excited and so handsome in his dark blue shirt that Donald had felt his breath catch. Hi, Kenneth had said, standing up as Donald approached the table, and there had been something almost formal about the gesture, like Kenneth was trying to do this right, to treat this like the significant occasion it was. Hi, Donald had replied, and they'd stood there for a moment, both of them seeming uncertain about the appropriate greeting. A handshake seemed ridiculous given what had happened between them the night before, but a kiss felt too public, too presumptuous for this early stage of whatever they were becoming. Kenneth had solved the dilemma by reaching out and squeezing Donald's hand briefly before they'd both sat down, and the simple contact had been enough to ease some of the awkwardness. Dinner had been wonderful, filled with the kind of easy conversation they'd always shared, but now layered with new meaning, new possibility. They'd talked about their childhoods, their families, their dreams for the future, all the getting to know you conversations that felt both necessary and natural. I called my sister this afternoon, Kenneth had said over dessert, his spoon playing absently with his tiramisu. I told her I'd met someone. Donald had felt his heart skip a beat at the casual way Kenneth had referred to him as someone, at the implication that Kenneth was already thinking of this as something worth sharing with his family. "What did you tell her about me?" Donald had asked. "That you make me feel like myself," Kenneth had said, meeting Donald's eyes across the table. "That you're kind and funny and brilliant, and that I'm falling in love with you." The words had hit Donald like a physical blow, not because they were unwelcome, but because they'd articulated something he'd been feeling, but hadn't been ready to name. "Are you," Donald had asked, his voice barely above a whisper, "falling in love with me?" "I think I already have," Kenneth had said simply, and Donald had felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes at the quiet certainty in Kenneth's voice. "I love you too," Donald had said, the words feeling both terrifying and inevitable. "I think I've been in love with you for months." Kenneth had reached across the table and taken Donald's hand, their fingers intertwining automatically, and they'd sat there in the dim light of the wing restaurant, holding hands and looking at each other like they'd just discovered something miraculous, which Donald had thought maybe they had. After dinner, they'd walk slowly back to Kenneth's apartment, neither of them ready for the evening to end, both of them seeming to savor this time when everything was new and perfect and full of possibility. "Will you stay tonight?" Kenneth had asked as they'd stood outside his building, and something in his voice had made it clear that he wasn't asking for anything more than Donald's presence, that he just wanted to fall asleep and wake up knowing that this was real, that Donald was there. "Yes," Donald had said without hesitation, and Kenneth had smiled, that brilliant, transformative smile that made Donald feel like he could conquer the world. They had spent the evening on Kenneth's couch, talking and kissing, and simply being together, learning the rhythms of this new intimacy, discovering what it felt like to touch and be touched by someone who genuinely wanted them. When they had finally gone to bed, they'd held each other close, Donald's head on Kenneth's chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat and marveling at the fact that this was his life now, that this man who had seemed so impossible to reach was holding him like he was something precious. "Are you happy?" Kenneth had whispered into the darkness, his fingers running gently through Donald's hair. "Happier than I've ever been," Donald had whispered back, and it had been the absolute truth. They had fallen asleep like that, wrapped around each other, and Donald had slept more peacefully than he had in months, his dreams filled with possibility and hope and the sound of Kenneth's laughter. Which brought them to this moment, 3 months later. Standing in Donald's apartment as the sun set outside the windows, as Donald finally found the courage to articulate what he'd been feeling for so long. Kenneth was looking at him with an expression of such love, such understanding, that Donald felt like he might burst from the sheer intensity of it. "You're the only one who calms me," Donald continued, his voice stronger now, more certain. "When I'm with you, I feel like I can breathe properly for the first time in my life. When you're not here, I feel like I'm drowning in my own skin, like I'm pretending to be someone I'm not, just to get through the day." Kenneth had moved closer while Donald was talking, close enough now that Donald could see the unshed tears in his eyes, could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "I've been trying to figure out how to tell you this for weeks," Donald said, his hands still trembling slightly but his voice steady. "I've been walking around feeling like I'm going to explode from keeping it inside, and I realized tonight that I can't do it anymore. I can't keep pretending that what I feel for you is anything less than complete, overwhelming, terrifying love." Kenneth reached up and cupped Donald's face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away tears that Donald hadn't realized he was crying. "Donald," Kenneth said softly, and his name in Kenneth's mouth sounded like a prayer, like a promise. "I love you too. I love you so much it scares me sometimes. How much I need you, how much better everything is when you're here. Donald felt something that had been tight and anxious in his chest finally loosen, finally relax as Kenneth's words washed over him. I was so afraid, Donald whispered, leaning into Kenneth's touch. I was so afraid that I was too much, that these feelings were too big, too intense with my mom. Never, Kenneth said firmly, his forehead coming to rest against Donald's. You could never be too much. You're exactly what I've been looking for my entire life. I just didn't know it until I found you. They kissed then, soft and sweet and full of all the love they'd been carrying for each other, and Donald felt like he was finally, completely home. When they pulled apart, both of them breathing slightly harder, Kenneth smiled and brushed a strand of hair away from Donald's forehead. So what happens now? Kenneth asked, echoing the question he'd asked months ago in his office. Now we stop being afraid, Donald said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. Now we stop pretending that this is anything other than the most important thing that's ever happened to either of us. Kenneth's smile was radiant, transformative, and Donald felt his heart swell with so much love he thought it might actually burst. I like the sound of that, Kenneth said, and then he was kissing Donald again, and Donald was kissing him back, and everything else faded away except for this moment. This man, this love that felt like coming home after a lifetime of being lost. Outside, the city continued its evening rhythm, people hurrying home from work, couples meeting for dinner, the ordinary magic of lives intersecting and diverging in the endless dance of human connection. But inside Donald's apartment, two men who had found each other against all odds held each other close and marveled at the simple, extraordinary miracle of being exactly where they belonged.